guys, and welcome to the HJW Gaming channel and a continuation of my faction guides for Lord of the Rings Rise to War. In this video I'm going to be taking a look at the good side faction Rohan and breaking down all of the advantages and disadvantages of playing this faction. I really hope you enjoy. So Rohan is one of the most popular good side factions, players seeking to take advantage mainly of the strong stats of mounted units. The starting commander given to players who choose Rohan is Éowyn. Éowyn is a strong tier 1 commander who makes excellent use of mounted units, particularly melee and men mounted units, such as those available from Rohan and also from Gondor. She is a very versatile and useful commander, good for taking tiles thanks to healing and damage reduction skills, whilst also being good for PvP. Her Respect 10 item is good whilst not being top tier, though can be very useful for countering meta good side commanders who focus on range damage, such as Haldir and Gil-galad. She is, in my opinion, the second best tier 1 commander in the game, behind Dwalin on the good side, so is definitely worth some investment. For units, Rohan starts with the Rohirrim Quarters, which allows the use of men units including mounted units. These units are pretty mediocre for early game. Whilst the mounted cavalry have good attack stats and move fast, they do cost a lot of resources to conscript, which can stall your progress in the early game. In addition, Rohan doesn't pick up a unit with strong defensive stats until the third quarters is unlocked, the Dwarven Quarters. Therefore, early game, you are likely to lose a lot of units and expend significant resources conscripting these expensive units. So whilst Rohan is thought of as the strongest mounted cavalry faction, you actually don't unlock the most defensive cavalry unit, which is the Cataphract, until the final quarters, which is when you unlock the Númenórean men. This leaves you constantly having to spend enormous amounts of resources on new troops just to keep yourself moving forwards. The Elven Quarters is the second quarters you unlock. However, this does nothing to help provide defensive units and doesn't synergise well with mounted commanders, except for the provision of bow knights, which can be used to add a mounted ranged unit. The additional issue with unlocking units in this order is for the first two quarters you'll be stuck using Rohirrim mounted units and Elven units, which have extremely poor siege capabilities, so you don't gain a good siege unit either until you unlock the Dwarven Quarters, which is your third set of units. To make matters worse, the unique unit available to Rohan, the Marshal, at first glance looks excellent, but actually performs as one of the worst tier 4 units from my experience. It functions very similar to the Cavalier, being a mounted unit with very high damage inflicted in the first few rounds thanks to high damage stats and the Onslaught ability, and they have extremely fast march speed. Defensively, however, they can be very brittle, with mounted doing very little to defend against poor HP and defense. The biggest issue with these units, however, is the cost. The resources required to conscript these units are extortionate, so when they die, you really feel the impact on both your barracks and your resources. In my opinion, the main selling point of a tier 4 unit is it should do something above and beyond the units you already have available. For example, the Iron Warrior of Erebor does a very similar job to the Guardian, however outputs an enormous amount more damage, whereas the Marshal is just far too similar to the Cavalier, in my opinion, to make it worth spending the resources on. The unique ring skill, for Theolingas, can be unlocked after ring level 50, and increases your reposition speed by 50%. This means that when moving a unit from your keep or fort to another, you will do so significantly faster. However, this does not affect march speed, so moving from one tile to another. So in war, this has very little upside. In my opinion, this is a very poor buff, especially when compared to other factions whose buffs give very large PvP advantages, which at the end of the day is what this game is all about. The location of Rohan is yet another weakness. Located in the centre of the map, Rohan is surrounded by possible opponents from all sides. To the north is Lothlorien, through Fangorn and Celebrant Fields. You have Mordor and Rhûn to the east, Gondor to the south, and Isengard to the west. After Season 2, the very popular evil faction Variags is also added to the mix in the east. In addition, some of these factions, particularly Lothlorien, Gondor and Variags, are very popular factions, so will likely be strong if you're brought to conflict. After a few weeks of the server, often Variags or Mordor, and potentially Gondor too, will have pushed up from the southeast, so with many factions in the close vicinity, early war is very hard to avoid for Rohan. To make matters worse, neutral keeps are hard to find for Rohan in the early game. Once the Wold is captured, all other surrounding keeps are at least 600 power, with the next nearest 160 power keeps after being Southern Anduin Vale, which is nearer to Lothlorien, Ashen Plains, which is by Variags, Mordor and Rhûn, or Enedwaith, which is by Lindon and Isengard. This means after the Wold, progress for Rohan stalls until power are full enough to capture Emyn Muil, which can be very demotivating for players whilst other factions capture numerous keeps. When this is combined with the further roadblocks to progression caused by the expensive units and low siege, Rohan is an extremely slow starter in most servers. The alternate is being forced to march into the vicinity of other factions, which will lead to early war. One location advantage for Rohan, however, is that the capital, Edoras, is very well placed for defence and can be easily defended. To the south of Edoras, enemies are required to take multiple crossings, a strong keep in Dunharrow, and they are then bottlenecked through a thin pass to Edoras. There is also Rohan land on the other side of a nearby river, which Rohan can station enemies and forts on to defend Edoras, which can make it very difficult for enemies to reach. To the north, similar issues exist. Winding rivers and multiple crossings make it difficult for the enemy to take out defensive positions, and the pass to Edoras is also protected by a critical crossing. When looking towards trying to fight for the ring, Rohan is also well placed in this regard. Rohan is only 1 or 2 keeps away from Amon Lanc, with the Undeeps bordering the Wold and East Emnet. These territories are also on the western border of Amon Lanc, so are very close to Dol Guldur, so you'll be very well placed for a ring fight in future, if that's what you're looking towards. Looking at resources is where you start to see Rohan show its strengths. Whilst ore and stone can be more difficult to find, lumber and grain are plentiful. Rohan's primary source of resources lies in Fangorn, which is possibly the most resource-rich area in the game. It's an enormous expanse of dense lumber tiles of various high powers, starting at 90 and all the way up to 300. Rohan can therefore amass an enormous amount of power and lumber production once these tiles can be taken, though lose out somewhat by having to use the market function to convert these into other resources. This can be both a blessing and a curse, as large resource generation can be gained without having to march a long ways around the map and waste time. So mid-game, Rohan will typically gain power at an enormously fast rate. The downside, however, is that the majority of your faction resource generation will therefore be in Fangorn. And unlike the Iron Hills in Erebor, for example, it's located right in the centre of the map and is very hard to defend, with there being multiple entrances to Fangorn Forest. If an enemy managed to break into Fangorn, they can very quickly cripple Rohan's resource production and almost completely take them out the game. The neutral unit availability for Rohan is fairly mediocre. Ents are available, which whilst defensively strong, they're extremely slow, so feature primarily as a siege unit. You also have Wosis Hunters available, which are tier 3 ranged units capable of inflicting and resisting poison damage, which is a fairly niche requirement, with the only use I've seen being primarily on Isildur in a 3 ranged build. Overall, all of these are average units and not recommended for use except to target very specific threats. Rohan's biggest advantage, however, lies in their potential for levelling up commanders. In early game, they have an initial disadvantage in this regard due to the expensive units making it more difficult to take tiles. However, once commanders get access to stronger and more defensively capable units, there are numerous tunnels, crossings, and the level 35 Woes' Hunter camps that can be farmed for experience. In late game also, Rohan can explode into a complete other level due to the presence of the Ent tiles in Fangorn. Ents are probably the easiest unit in the game to farm from my experience. Due to their high level and low damage, they provide essentially just free XP for very little unit loss. Rohan's early unlock of Bow Knights in the second unlocked quarters, the Elven quarters, allows a unit that can provide huge amount of damage to large units whilst also resisting melee damage. All you need to do is put a strong melee tank at the front to make sure the Bow Knights don't get hit, and then they will output the rest of the damage. Fangorn also has an abundance of these tiles, which Rohan should look to use and harness to grow their commanders to levels far past their opponents, which should make up for their early disadvantage and then some. However, of course, this does depend on Rohan not being distracted by early war, which, as stated earlier, can be very difficult. So to summarise, Rohan is essentially the roulette table faction of this game. They can dominate if given time to get up and running, but can just as easily be dominated if early war halts them and stops them getting up ahead of steam. For beginner players, it can be tough as you need to know how best to harness Rohan's advantages, and experienced leadership is required to try and steer Rohan away from early trouble. And with that, that's everything I have to say about the Rohan faction. If you like what I've said, please drop a like and please consider subscribing. There will be more of these faction guides in future, and I also provide other content such as commander builds and other general Rise to War advice. Anyway, with that, I really hope to see you on the next one.